So, I'm going to read you a passage that tells about a really interesting inmate I met. And he was what's called a keep lock, which meant he did something bad, okay? He broke a rule, and so he's confined to his cell except for one exercise period a day. So, how'd you manage to get keep locked so soon? I asked him. Most guys, it takes a few weeks. The inmate smiled somewhat sheepishly. Unlike many keep locks, he had no problem with authority, or no problem with me at any rate. Just a hassle with another inmate's CO, he said, something I had to do. He was unremarkable enough to me at that point that I never even bothered to check further about what he was keep locked for. He remained a face in the crowd until one sweltering day in July when he was no longer keep locked. So, he did his 2 months or whatever, then he could mingle with everybody else. B block could get hot and sticky if there was no breeze outside, and on this day many of the inmates who went to the yard after midday chow peeled off their shirts before heading outside. Dela Cruz, as I'd learned this inmate was called, was one of these. As he did, I noticed a large tattoo spread across his chest like a banner. Assassin, it read. That was fairly interesting, but then I noticed his back, which was almost entirely covered by a long poem in Spanish, tattooed in a flowing script. That was fascinating, and in my surprise I said something like, "Whoa, what is that?" Dela Cruz gave a little smile and said, "It's a poem," and continued on his way out to the yard. When he returned, I tried to find out more. He brushed off my question about what poem it was, but he did explain how he'd gotten it. A white guy at Rikers Island was the artist, he said. The ink was made by burning plastic, a pen or a toothbrush, under a metal surface like the bottom of a bunk. You wiped off the thick soot, mixed it with toothpaste and soap, and there was your ink. Your pen was a pencil, your tattoo pen was a pencil with 2 needles tied to the point with string. The string soaked up the ink. The artist's many jabs left its residue under the surface of the skin. And if you've ever wondered why someone has such a lame tattoo on their hand or their arm, those are usually jailhouse tattoos. They're self-applied. 5 days later, Dela Cruz finally told me about the poem. It was from a book in the Rikers library that, quote, really meant a lot to me, he said, though he didn't like to talk about it. But who wrote it, I asked. It was a Jewish girl during World War II. I translated it into Spanish. You mean Anne Frank? The one who wrote a diary? He looked surprised. Yeah, I think that's it, he said. Anne Frank. On my next day off, I took Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl off my shelf and reread it. The parallel between a prison cell and the tiny space where Anne and her family had hidden from the Nazis in 1942 was immediately clear, as was the way that Anne, at 13, was imprisoned by her Jewish identity, by the very fact of who she was. There was no poem in my version of the diary, however, and I assumed it must have been included in a different edition. The next time I saw Dela Cruz, I told him about my rereading the book. I even let him know that I had visited the Anne Frank house on a trip to Holland and had seen the rooms where she had hidden. I must have been crazy to tell him that. Dela Cruz didn't really react with the interest I had expected. And I worried I'd gone too far, maybe sounding like a braggart, or claiming a personal interest in this story that was greater than his own, or seeming to pry. Or maybe the thought of a CO who'd been to Europe and was into Anne Frank was just too effing strange. So I laid off for a while. Dela Cruz, in the meantime, graduated to his own cell, but it was way upstairs on U and Z galleries, not on V. So we'd acknowledge each other in the mess hall or wherever our paths would cross. Then months later, December, I was back on V Gallery preparing to let my keep locks out for their daily rec when I discovered that among them was none other than Dela Cruz. He'd been locked up 2 days before, he explained, and then moved downstairs. Hey, you want to read that book again? I asked him. Yeah, he answered enthusiastically. I love that book. Thus, our acquaintance was re-established. I brought the book in, smuggled it technically, and peeked in on Dela Cruz as he savored it. He skipped rec and read it cover to cover. Then over the next few days, he read it again, slowly. I saw him discussing it with the inmate next door, another robber named Perez, and I worried he'd tell the man that I'd brought it in. I didn't want inmates to have anything on me, no matter how minor. That's why I let De La Cruz return the book, accepting it back with a measure of relief. He parted with it like an object of love. It's the best book I ever read, he said this time. I cried all the way through. Which you don't hear inmates say very often. I asked him if he'd seen the poem in there. No, he said, but the book he'd read the first time hadn't looked exactly like this one. Another edition, I again figured. After that, we talked often and easily. I liked De La Cruz initially because of the poem, and then later because I didn't think he bullshitted me or tried to get anything from me. He was keep locked this time, he said, for extorting from another inmate in the commissary. Huh, sounds bad, I said. De La Cruz didn't pretend to be ashamed. What can I tell you, Conover? It's what you do to survive. De La Cruz was short, fit, handsome, and dark-complected, with brown eyes and thick eyebrows. He was in for robbery, his 4th prison term, he said, after 3 in Virginia. Virginia! 2 for a period of months. I think it's the first time I've read this in Virginia. 2 for a period of months and a 3rd for 4 years. He'd entered Virginia's most famous prison, nicknamed the Wall. I hope this is accurate. At age 16, he said, because the state believed he was 18. His mother had brought him into the United States from Puerto Rico using the birth certificate of his older brother, who had died at age 2. That was the worst time, man. Being 16, sitting in that bus, looking out the window at the wall. Prison now at age 26 didn't seem so scary, and time didn't weigh on him as it once had, though he was serving a sentence of 10 years. In fact, he told me he was lucky that it was only 10 years. The immigrant victims of 2 of the robberies he'd been charged with most recently had refused to testify against him. I knew that this kind of reluctance was one reason that immigrants were often muggers' targets. He said he didn't even know the exact date he was keep locked until, but thought it was later that month. And it's a good thing it don't bother me, Conover, because it isn't the first time, and it won't be the last. I'd been working up to asking De La Cruz about his poem again to see if now he'd tell me the exact words tattooed on his back. But as I walked into B Block one afternoon, I saw Sergeant Murray escorting him out of the block with all his belongings. Murray later told me he'd been taken to 5 building after the superintendent received an anonymous letter claiming that when De La Cruz got off Keep Block, he'd be stabbed over money he owed. I wondered what De La Cruz hadn't told me. I remembered how often he did not take advantage of Keep Block rec, and realized now that he might have been afraid. I wondered whether he himself might have written that letter. I left Sing Sing before I found out the answers to my questions. But months later, when I'd become a civilian and De La Cruz had become an inmate at a medium security prison, I wrote him a letter with my post office box as a return address. I gave him some news about myself, then closed with a question. What were those lines of poetry on your back anyway? To my delight, he sent them to me in Spanish. I began my detective work. The library had plenty of editions of Anne Frank's diary, but not one included a poem. I consulted a couple of experts. Anne Frank had written some poetry, but nothing like the lines De La Cruz had sent me, they said. I wondered if De La Cruz was somehow mistaken. But then I decided that, addiction to robbery aside, he seemed like a together enough person to keep straight the source of a poem he had inscribed on his own back. I sat down and read the diary one more time, looking for a clue, a reference, a snippet of something that I might have missed. I found it on the last page in the very last words. Not poetry in stanzas, just Frank's prose. De La Cruz had translated into Spanish from an English translation of Anne Frank's original Dutch, but the gist was still there. It was unmistakable. This is what it said, when everybody starts hovering over me, I get cross, then sad, and finally end up turning my heart inside out, the bad part on the outside and the good part on the inside, and keep trying to find a way to become what I'd like to be and what I could be if only there were no other people in the world. It was easier to stay incurious as an officer. Under the inmates' surface bluster, their cruelty and selfishness was almost always something ineffably sad.